Hello guys, welcome back to the channel and welcome to this video. It's all of the highlights from the Gaydon Jaguar Rally 2023. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Gaydon Jaguar Rally. It's great to see so many of you joining us. As you can see, we have our main arena, and we're going to start this.
Yes.
Who's got the keys? Is this you, sir? Have you got the keys for this?
I have the pleasure of doing this, yes.
So very quickly, for our younger members of the audience, tell us what's under the bonnet.
It's a V12 straight through pipes on it, full race engine.
Fantastic. So the size of the V12, 6 litre or larger?
6 litre, yeah.
Excellent. Naturally aspirated as well, so we get the full noise, the full sound of the induction, and straight through that exhaust pipe. Right then, let me see if I can get the audience to give you a countdown. Are you all set? Alright then. Ladies and gents, do you want to hear this start up? Well, you do. The rest of the people, though, not that bothered. Do you want to hear it start? That's more like it. Right, should we do a countdown? Ready? 3, 2, 1. Wow, that's low. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together.
Woo! Let's start, ladies and gentlemen, in 1923, when the Automobile Club de l'Ouest started a small race around the country lanes of Le Mans in France to prove the motor vehicle. Not only the motor vehicle, but of course the endurance of the people who were there to drive it. It was always really referred to as a British race run in France, because it became very important for all British manufacturers, almost from the word go. Of course, the big Bentleys taking the win for the Brits in the 1920s, and then of course Le Mans had to make way for the small element of the Second World War. But when racing came back in 1948, it was all to play for, and there was a new manufacturer in town who was there beating everyone, and that manufacturer, of course, was Ferrari. Meanwhile, over in Coventry, during the Second World War, some very clever engineers had gathered and had been recruited by Sir William Lyons, of course, and not much had been happening in the way of cars down at Foals Hill during that period in time, because of course they were all completely dedicated to the war effort. But one of the tasks that they had was to be on what they called fire watch, and you can imagine it, Neil, can't you? Not much to do but watch the skies for marauding bombers ready to drop bombs on your factory. And there wasn't much to do. So what did they do with their time while they were on fire watch at the factory? They designed what would be probably one of the world's most versatile, strong and powerful engines ever. And by 1948, the very first motor show was happening here in the UK after the Second World War. They launched it to the world. Of course, it was the XK engine, and it was in, ladies and gentlemen, a car much like this. Here is an iconic example of the XK 120. Knob 120, a rally car, of course, that was piloted so well by Ian Appleyard back in the day. But of course, this was never really supposed to be a car that went into production. It was something that they'd crafted in the factory using alloy panels. Alloy, of course, aluminium sheet is what they'd used to build aircraft during the Second World War, so it was pretty plentiful around the factory at that time. Plus it's very easy to be able to manipulate and mould it by hand, much easier than steel, and they certainly didn't have the resources for clay at that time either. So from 1948 right the way through till the early part of 1950, XK120s, of course, were made out of alloy, and of course later on, by the time Prestell Fisher and the people building the body panels had tooled up to make them out of steel, the transition came, as so did the 1950s. But of course, that XK engine that had been in the XK120 started to prove itself not only as a very refined engine for saloon cars, but a very powerful engine as well. And Sir William Lyons and the team he had around him knew that what they needed to do to prove the success of what they'd had before the war with the SS90 and SS100 was to go back to motorsport. They did so quite successfully in rallying, and Knob 120 here, as we'll discover more of the story about throughout the day, was a great example of that. But as the XK120 turned into the XK120C, it became a serious racing car, and it would grace the circuit at the ACO's Le Mans in the 1950s. That would ultimately lead to Jaguar's first Le Mans victory in 1951 with a Jaguar C-Type driven by two drivers, both called Peter Walker and Peter Whitehead, and it would be the start of the success of Jaguar, and it would be the start of Jaguar being a household name, because up until that point they were a pretty obscure coach builder in actual fact. They were a very small scale production car. Yes, the XK120 had taken the motor show by storm, and the Mark V was a brand new saloon on the scene, but really they needed to prove themselves, and prove themselves they did in 1951. 1952 came along and they wanted to enter a works team of C-Types once again, but Sterling Moss enters the story at this point, and he knew that what he needed to get from the Jaguar C-Type was 20 miles per hour more on the Mulsanne Straight. So he suggested some tweaks, and this was quite unlike Sir William Lyons to allow tweaks to be made last minute to the cars. But off to Le Mans they went with a slightly more aerodynamic body on the XK120C. The C-Type that had won in 1951 now looked a little bit longer at the front. Unfortunately, it proved to be a disaster, because that extra bodywork aimed at giving the car more aerodynamics actually made it overheat. Two of the cars retired in 1952 with overheating problems. Sterling Moss's car actually didn't. He was running very well in second place at certain points during the race, but then at some point, unfortunately, he dropped oil pressure and retired. So you might think that things are starting to take a turn for the worst for Jaguar, but then enter a new team in 1953, and one of the best stories, I think, in racing ever. 1953, the Jaguar team would return with another works team to Le Mans, C-Types of course, and they would win once again with Tony Rolt and Duncan Hamilton at the wheel. Now, if you're a Duncan Hamilton fan, this is a very special day, because if you go and look into the Jaguar Daimler Heritage Trust collection today, you'll be able to see some of Duncan Hamilton's memorabilia, won't you, Neil? It's all in there. Tell us what you can see.
Yeah, so we've got an exhibition. We're launching it today with some artifacts from the family, and I'm very pleased to say that the family is represented today. So if we can introduce you to, shall we?
Let's bring them in. We've got Stuart, I can see. Let's have Stuart in, and Dom as well. Let's have the Hamilton family in. Ladies and gentlemen, the descendants of those two, the one in 1953 in the C-Type at Le Mans. Put your hands together, please, for the Hamilton family and Stuart Rolt. See, I told you we'd bring you some superstar guests today. Okay, so let me start with you, Stuart. Your dad, Tony, of course, amazing story before motorsport. He was a war hero, wasn't he? And he was a man who knew the inside of concentration camps rather too well.
Yes, sadly he was captured at the very beginning of the war, spent 5 years trying to escape, and he got a military cross for his efforts, ended up in Colditz, where he was responsible for getting the famous Colditz glider built. But he was a very unhappy prisoner, and he tried to escape a total of 7 attempts, twice of which he was on the run, but always recaptured.
And of course, if you go to that amazing place, not only is it quite chilling to look around the exhibitions that they've got there, but you can also see a scale model of the small aeroplane that he was involved in building, but luckily didn't have to use. You can still see it, can't you?
Well, the Germans, and I hope there are lots of Germans here, but extraordinarily, they have built a tourist attraction out of a prison camp. And Colditz is brilliantly put together, and they have built a full-scale model, not a scale model, a full-scale model of the glider as it would have been, which is in the attic when you go up there.
I mention it because it sort of gives you a bit of background of the sort of guys that were racing in the 1950s, and when you watch some of the period footage of, you know, just how many people lost their lives and kind of how blasé they were about it in a way, it's easy to understand, I think, if you look at it in the context of the fact that they'd seen the worst things imaginable during the war that had come before. Do you think that had a part to play in the way that the 1950s for motorsport unfolded?
Absolutely. My father lost his best friend on the second day that they went to France to fight, and they fought at Calais. They were either killed or captured, and his best chum was killed there and then, and they lived through that era, and their friends were being killed. When they came back, I think, to go motor racing, didn't seem that dangerous, and they lived with that risk. And it went on for a long time, long after the 50s. This was a very dangerous sport for so long, as everybody knows.
How did Tony manage to get into the Jaguar team? How did that introduction occur?
Well, there's a nice story there. Before the war, he had bought an ERA. He persuaded his mother to buy him an ERA called Remus, and the car was delivered to this small Welsh farm where they lived by a man called Lofty England, who was, of course, became team manager and a Jaguar legend. And so after the war, when my father started racing again, there was a moment when they needed an extra driver to go to Dundrod, a really dangerous circuit in Ulster, and Dad went there and did a very good time as a reserve driver and was called into the squad and never looked back.
And of course, today you're stood here with your very good friends from the Hamilton side of the story, and your families are still very close and friendly to this day. Were they two drivers that were best pals almost from the get-go, do you think, when they came together, Duncan and Tony?
Yes, they met after the war, not during the war, and they met through motor racing, and they were both doing exactly the same sort of events. And there was a moment when I think Dad was given the chance to who would he like to drive with in the team, and he said the man I wanted in the team is Duncan Hamilton, and he got him in, and the rest is history.
Here we have well, the descendants of Duncan Hamilton. Don, tell everyone your family connection to Duncan.
Duncan was my grandfather.
And Caroline, introduce yourself as well.
Yes, he was my father.
So we have the daughter and the grandson here, and give us a little bit of an idea of Duncan the man, and what we know of his character and his personality. Some of those will be sort of giving a sort of wry smile at this point if they've read the book Touched Wood. He did like a joke, didn't he, Duncan?
Yes, he did, he did. He had a very large personality. He was a great storyteller.
So, obviously the Hamilton name continues in Jaguar in particular, and in classic cars, Dom.
Very much so.
Your family is still selling the best cars in the world to this day.
Yeah.
Tell us about what you know of Duncan Hamilton the man, and what we should take away from today when thinking about him.
Well, as a small boy growing up with a grandfather who was such a character, and many a tall story to tell, some more accurate than others, was a huge privilege. And 70 years ago, standing here today with so many people, is a huge honour, and I think it's such a significant result. To win Le Mans, first car to average over 100 miles an hour, first car to win on disc brakes, not to mention with a broken windscreen and a broken nose. It should be commemorated and remembered, and I hope everybody enjoys the exhibitions at the Collection Centre.
It's going to be fantastic to have a look at those. I was very lucky to meet you guys earlier in the year when we filmed some of the Jaguar Daimler Heritage Trust archive footage, and you let me touch and look through the box that everyone can see in there today, including his racing boots and his helmet and all sorts of different bits of memorabilia from around the world and all the travels that he went on. It's an incredible thing to see, isn't it?
Well, he took that box with him to every race he ever entered, and I think after he retired, as Caroline would attest, it just sort of sat on the floor in his dressing room, and then
He took it on his holiday. That was his suitcase wherever he went. Yeah, when he travelled to Nice and things. That was Dad's suitcase.
It was the most awkward shaped suitcase I think I've ever seen. It is a dead cube, isn't it?
It is.
And when you have a look, ladies and gentlemen, at the display inside the Heritage Trust building today, you might be looking through and you'll see some of the artefacts in there that will make total sense. Race boots, a helmet, some money for various currencies. But there's also, Don, a set of ladies' tights in the box.
There are.
And they are significant. Tell us what
they are significant. He put them there, not anybody else.
They weren't planted.
No. But when racing a C-type or a D-type, you did not have a windscreen wiper, or we had a visor of sorts, with really goggles. But they came in very handy when wiping rain off your lenses. So always race with ladies' tights, being the most effective route. Stockings, I beg your pardon. Not Christmas stockings. And that was the most effective way of seeing straight.
Well, let me tell everyone the story of the 1953 Le Mans win and the events leading up to it. Let me tell the story, and then you can tell me whether it's right or wrong. Okay? Stuart's groaning because he's done this so many times. But some people here might never have heard the story of the incredible events leading up to the 1953 win. And some of it, I now have to say with tongue-in-cheek, because later on, of course, we found that some of this has been, let's say, a play on the truth, perhaps. So, I've already told you the story of 1952. The team really struggled with aerodynamics and overheating. All three cars that were entered as the works team had retired. So in 1953, with a new team of drivers, the pressure was on, and they qualified very, very well indeed during the Thursday session at the lead-up to the 53 Le Mans. So much so that Sterling Moss wanted to jump in one of the cars and go for a quick spin and test it out for himself. Unfortunately, a technicality in the regulations said that you couldn't go out in a qualifying car, and two of those cars were in the same numbers, and they'd broken rules, and it all came to a head when the ACO disqualified Duncan Hamilton and Tony Rolt's car from the race. So the story goes that at this point they head off into town, hit the bars of Le Mans to drown their sorrows. Meanwhile, team boss Lofty England is away at ACO HQ pleading his case. Lofty England brought in Sir William Lyons and paid a small fine. And ultimately it would mean that Duncan Hamilton and Tony Rolt's car would be able to run in the race in 1953. The problem was, according to the story, they were 3 sheets of the wind in a bar down somewhere in the middle of Le Mans, completely stoned, drinking the night away, completely unaware of the fact that they're going to have to get up and race. And the story continues, the legend has it, that they got slapped round the face, sobered up a bit with a bit of black coffee and taken out to race, and they did the race, and as Duncan was going around they were feeding him black coffee, and he was saying, no, it's just making me jittery, give me a brandy instead. The story, ladies and gentlemen, gets bigger and bigger and bigger. It's all in the book, Touch Wood, it's a fascinating read. However, it has come to light in recent times that, of course, the timelines of this story don't quite add up. Practice would have been on Thursday. Of course, there's no racing on Friday, so if they'd have hit the bars on Thursday, they wouldn't have been still drunk for the race start on Saturday afternoon. And also, I think the story takes away a little bit of the grit and determination and, let's be honest, the talent that both Tony Rolt and Duncan Hamilton had. More than that, there were some events during the race that could have taken any other team out completely. Stuart mentioned the broken windscreen there. There was a bird strike at Mulsanne during the night that completely smashed the screen on the 1953 car. Stuart has that very screen in his possession to this day. All of these things would not have been able to have been coped with, I don't think, with a couple of drivers who are either hungover or still suffering the effects. So, Stuart, it's a great story, isn't it? It's one for the papers. It's certainly got everyone talking about Jaguar and Duncan Hamilton, but we don't really think it's true, do we?
Well, I've done this so many times now. I'm the sort of killjoy of the party. But it used to upset my dad quite a bit, this story, because it's, what's the polite word? Wrong. He used a stronger word than that. It's a great story written by Duncan in Touchwood, which is a great yarn. But you got it spot on about the practice on Thursday, day off on Friday, couldn't have been. And the idea that Sir William Lyons personally drove into Le Mans to find them in the bars with our mutual mothers also is a load of rubbish. And it's a great story, but I'm afraid it also, you said it right, that from my father's point of view, who took his racing very seriously, it used to upset him that anyone would think that that's what they did. But actually, it was a bloody hard race, and you had to be very honest. And they were very proud of their win, and that one, for him, that just was something that took it away. But Duncan's writing was great to read, but not always totally accurate.
Well, I think, Tom, it does give us an idea of the sort of man we're dealing with here, doesn't it? He does love a good joke and a great story, and that is part of the personality and the legacy that he leaves behind, isn't it?
Yes, I mean, he was a larger-than-life character. Great fun to be around. Very kind, very fortunate, and his stories will rumble on for a long time yet, which is the trouble. We're trying to put a halt to some of them, but no, he was certainly a larger-than-life character, but most importantly, he was an exceptionally good and successful racing driver, and coupled with Tony, you know, they go together a bit like Marks and Spencer's, like Papa and Tony do for Jaguar, and I think they were Jaguar's most successful racing pairing together.
Well, certainly Duncan went on to buy Jaguars from the factory and race them,
yeah.
Funded by his own desire to take the brand to a win. And he went all over the world, didn't he? There was a particular instant in Portugal where he hit a lamppost and took the power out for the whole city in the valley. And he did all of that, basically funding his own racing in often cases and actually buying the car from Jaguar himself. So shows how much passion he had for the Jaguar brand.
He did. He brought the first ever C-Type. He was the first customer, and he raced that in the Isle of Man, first outing, and broke the lap record, I think, by about 6 seconds.
Incredible. Well, I must just say a huge thank you to you and the Hamilton family for allowing us into some of the memorabilia that you hold of Duncan Hamilton, and for showing that to everyone here this weekend.
Pleasure.
It is something really special, and you know, it's great to keep these stories alive and to keep the memory of these heroes. And ladies and gentlemen, they really were heroes back in those days. You see Le Mans now and you see the floodlit corners, the perfect tarmac, the cambers engineered into every curve on the track. Back then, they were driving with cars that had very questionable headlamps, they were driving on dirt roads, and they were driving really in the knowledge that quite possibly they might not come home tonight. And it's always important to remember that, the bravery that they showed to do something to make a British brand great. And I think it was really an extension of the patriotism that he showed during the war. Do you think that, Dom?
Very much so. They raced for Queen and country, as much as they did for the British car manufacturer.
Not for the money.
Not for the money, no.
I would like to, of course not for the money, Dom. I would like to add one thing to that our mothers were in the pits through these very long and grueling races, doing a fantastic support act. Compared to the pits today, they just had to make do with what there was and keep these boys going. And it was a big tribute to them that they were so successful.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you ever wonder why people wax lyrical and get all misty-eyed about the 1950s in motorsport, I hope that gives you an insight as to why. The heroics, the ability of men and machine to go against the odds, that is why that period in time is so special. That is why the memory of Duncan Hamilton and Tony Roll needs protecting and remembering for the future. So please put your hands together for Dom Hamilton, Caroline, the Hamilton family, and Stuart Roll. Well, I'm not going to say anything as soon as it fires up. Be enjoyed, ladies and gentlemen.
Because we're going to talk now about this, which is, no word of a lie, one of my all-time favourite cars. I'm going to steal the microphone, if that's okay. Thank you very much, Wayne. Here you are, Bob. Come on over, come on over. Tell me, I mean, I adore these. I remember when I was a child, Bob, I had a book. It was about this big, and it had got 100 cars in there, and the page I always went to had this on it. I adore them.
Okay, well, certainly, yeah. I think that Wayne, by the way, I can't follow Wayne. I think he was outstanding, he really was, so I'll do my best. But let's talk about the origins of this car. I think that's what it's all about, really, because I'm pretty privileged enough to have met the designer of the car and been in his company on many occasions, and that was Jim Randall. And this car really started off at Christmas 1987, basically. And it was the sort of Christmas holidays at Jaguar, and Jim was the technical director at Jaguar at the time. An interesting man, not an easy man to get to know, actually. You know, he's one of those people who sort of was always a little bit suspicious of you. I don't know why, but he was a very difficult man to talk to. But once you got to know him, he was jovial and quite good at jokes and things. But there we are. But anyway, it was Christmas in the household at Randall's. And he sort of decided with his son to sit down and build a Group C sports car in cardboard. And that's what they did. They built the layout of the car in cardboard. And he was quite impressed with his own workmanship, in all honesty. And he went back to work, you know, in the first week of January, and he said, you know, this looks good in cardboard. Let's think about building this, but I won't tell the boss, you know, John Egan, I won't tell the boss. So we got one or two people together on a Saturday morning, they called it the Saturday Morning Club, and also he rang up various suppliers, like Abbey Panels, because he needed a bonnet and so on, and the glass people, Triplex and so on. And amazingly, he managed to do it virtually in secret. It wasn't completely in secret because I knew about it, and I knew various people who were involved in it because I only lived 3 miles from Rounds Lane, you see. So I'd heard all about it. Anyway, they built the car, but it wasn't quite like this one, as it happens. It was a good foot longer, even wider, and also it got a V12 engine in it, which was the intention all along. And the idea was as well to have it four-wheel drive, and also with anti-lock braking system, which is normal on most cars now, but it wasn't then. You know, it was considered to be quite avant-garde. And so, yeah, they built the car, and John Egan, they thought, we better tell him about this. And I remember John went down to the workshop, and by this time it was around about September of '88. And there he was, sat in the middle of the workshop, and he thought, oh my God, have we built this then? And I don't know whether he actually argued about the budget and so on, but most of the people had done the work for free, and they've never really been paid. But anyway, Sir John Egan thought, well, this is going to be a bit of a showstopper. So it was there at the 88 Motor Show, which in those days was at the National Exhibition Centre, not that far away here in Birmingham. And I remember going there, and again, luckily because of the position I was in, I was able to get right up to the car. But yeah, it was at least 3 and 4 people deep around the Jaguar stand. I've never seen anything quite like it. Everybody on tiptoes like this, trying to see this car. And it really caused an absolute, if ever a car caused a sensation, that was it. And I feel privileged to have actually been there when this happened. And of course, people said, I want one of those. Including people like Elton John and people like that, you know. All sorts of personalities sort of said, well, I want one of those. Anyway, Jim Randall was the guest speaker at the Midland Area Jaguar Drivers Club dinner, where I was the chairman, I'm pleased to say. And he came along and he said, I've got an exciting announcement for you all. And we were the first in the Midland Area Jaguar Drivers Club to actually find out that they were going to go into production. But as we all know, the production vehicle was significantly different from the actual prototype car. And I was part of a syndicate to buy one of these things, because what happened was Jaguar sort of said, right, if you want one, you've got to put a £50,000 deposit down. So there were various syndicates of which I was one. But then, of course, when the actual real life car came out, so many people pulled out because it wasn't what they expected.
No, that V12 wasn't in there, was it?
It was a
missing a few cylinders.
Yeah, we only had 6 cylinders, not 12. It was not 4-wheel drive. I'm not sure about the ABS. I don't think it's got ABS on it either. But it certainly wasn't what they expected. And of course, the car was significantly shorter. Jim Randall, by the way, of the design, he thought it was great design, but he thought there was too much at the front, by the way. He thought the front overhang was a little bit too great. We should have brought that back or put the wheels slightly further forward. So that was actual Jim himself criticising the end product. But I think the end product is without doubt one of the most extraordinary vehicles ever. Not just the Jaguar, it's extraordinary.
Oh, it's unbelievable. Like I say, when I was a child, interestingly, I was born at pretty much the same time this car was born. I was 87, 88. I'm quite a young man. But when I was a child, like, I remember seeing this in this little book, which I have still got. It's still sat in my drawers in my bedroom. And I'm going to pass it on to my daughter when she's a little bit older. And it's all roughed up around the edges because I've spent days and days and days looking through. When I went to bed at night, because you sit there looking at this little book, and there was a small picture of one of these in this colour, and I used to spend hours. And I'm not making this up, I'd spend hours just staring at it. And in there was also the McLaren F1, and I was furious that the F1 had got the record for being the fastest car. I was like, it should be the 220, but just look at it.
I think nowadays this would be called ADHD in actual fact or something like that. It's staring at the...
I think so, but just look at even now.
It is staggering. In actual fact, if you produce this car now, you know, there would be 1 or 2 issues with the actual car itself because it wouldn't pass certain tests. But nonetheless, it would stagger people even today.
I mean, my daughter hasn't seen one of these yet. Hopefully next year. She's 3 next year. Whose is this? Quick, it's yours. Will you bring it back next year? Yes, okay, so next year, if I'm invited back to Jaguar Rally, I'm going to bring my 3-year-old daughter and see if she has the same reaction as I did when I was 3 years old. So this is yours, you own this.
I do, yes.
Come over.
We're all jealous, by the way.
I know, we're all jealous. All I want to do now is spend the next 4 hours becoming your best friend. Oh, no, that's good. Where are the keys? No. How long have you had it for?
I bought the car about 8 years ago. I got it from a guy in France. I'd, a bit like you, had the book with the posters and all that sort of thing. But for me, it was always a toss-up between the 220 and the girl with the tennis racket walking towards the...
Yeah, but you're a little bit older than me.
Yeah, exactly. And I realised she was unattainable, and my wife wasn't so keen on that particular one.
I've also heard that famous picture, it's not a she.
Oh well, that's just warped my mind, I'm afraid. So I went to Le Mans, funnily enough, and saw Nielsen and Coulthard, Brabham win the catalytic converter race, shall we call it. Fell in love with the thing even more. And then as time moved on, it became possible for me to consider owning one, and I got a pass from the boss and started looking, and I came across a number of cars, some of them delivery mileage, some of them used, and I particularly didn't want a delivery mileage car. I know that sounds a bit crackers, but I didn't really want to take a delivery mileage car and convert it into something to drive. And I found this car from a chap in France, brought it back over, and then literally stripped it to a shell, had new glass made for it, had manufactured new nodders for the suspension, sent all the OEM bits back to the OEM providers and had them all rebuilt, and basically went from front to back with hoses, bearings, rose joints, the lot, and rebuilt it. And that's a bit of a labour of love. But that was the way I wanted to do it, because a lot of these cars haven't turned a wheel in a long time, and I think they all need recommissioning, so I decided to go that route.
Cars don't work very well when they've been sat around. They get a bit stiff, things get a bit delicate, a little bit taut and so forth, and you only need one crack in the wrong place, say along the fuel line, for it all to go horribly wrong.
No, you're absolutely right, and I think, you know, for me, a car, beautiful though this is, it's beautiful in its environment, and that environment is on a road or a racetrack. And so seeing it static in the middle of here is very nice, and you can appreciate the curves, you can look at the Venturis, you can look at all of those aspects of it, and it will put a smile on your face, certainly does mine. But obviously when you see it driving down the road or cornering or whatever, it takes on a new life, doesn't it? And that for me is an important part of cars.
So the question I'm sure everybody wants to know, myself included, what's it like to drive?
You know, it's really nice. I think what's fascinating in the day of the internet and the internet know-alls, shall we say, is that we get bombarded by these people who've never even seen one, sat in one, who'll tell you it has a mini Metrio engine, who'll tell you that it's too wide to drive on the road. You know, it's no bigger than a Range Rover, it's just a lot lower. And if you can drive a Range Rover down the road, why can't you drive this? The car drives really, really nicely. Those of you who know more about the mechanical side of things on the car, it is a rose jointed suspension system. So it doesn't have the rubber compliance elements in it that you might find in a modern car. And so you do find it perhaps tracks on white lines and things like that a little more readily than a modern car. But it's very, very plantable and very placeable, it's very precise, and it's very enjoyable as a consequence.
I mean, you've been through this bolt by bolt. How does it drive like a 30-year-old car?
Absolutely not in my eye. I mean, I've driven lots of cars over the years. There's very few that I would compare with this car in the same overall context. It pulls like a train, it handles extremely nicely, and it's a pleasure to be behind the wheel. I've had cars and driven cars that are lovely to look at, but actually when you get the experience of driving them, you perhaps fall out of love with them a little bit. I fall a bit more in love with this every time I get behind the wheel.
Fabulous. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for our owner here. Thank you very much, sir. And if you just want to put the keys in that commentary point later, that'll be perfect. I have actually got one last question. Do you fancy taking me out in it?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I'm not as glamorous as that, you know, that beautiful tennis player, but, you know, me and him might have more in common than you know.
Well, you never know, do you? But it's safer taking you out in that from a financial point of view than taking the blonde out in it.
I think so, absolutely wonderful. Rob, these were built just down the road from where I live now, down in Bloxham. Like you say, they just couldn't build something like this now.
Well, I don't know about that, but the build process was quite simple and straightforward, actually. There was no actual, they were all in a production line, but they really pushed them from one point to another. There were each build station, and each engineer that did their job on the car. I actually, again, was privileged enough to actually be there when they were making them. And yeah, each person was responsible for their own task and actually checked their own work. It was an unusual form of quality management, but nonetheless the end product was actually very good indeed. As you might expect for a car that was, you know, about £400,000 list, 415 I think it was. But there we are. So yeah, it was really quite something to see them being built at Bloxham. Also the end product as well, the different colours that people requested, there were some quite outrageous ones as well. So there we are. But it was wonderful to see it. They made, I think, 281 of them. I think that's the number, 281. Interesting enough, because of the issues about them not being what people expected, there were quite a few cars left over at the end of the production run that were unsold. And they were actually kept in an area called Track 6 at Jaguar factory in Coventry Browns Lane, and they're all encapsulated in plastic, like a huge plastic bag over the cars, and they were stored there for quite a long time. And I really wish I could remember the gentleman in the USA who got the USA traffic rules changed so that the car couldn't be sold in the States because there were certain limitations on selling the car in the States. He got the rules changed for the cars in the States, and by this time Grange Motors down south had bought them all. And Grange Motors sold a lot overnight into the USA. They did very well indeed on it, but there you are, I think that's the story. But yes, to actually go to Track 6, where they used to actually have the Series 1 XJ6 going down, to see them all stored there was quite extraordinary. They're all left hookers, of course. I should say left-hand drive, I shouldn't be common like that, should I? They're all left-hand drive, but they're all encapsulated in plastic sheeting, and yes, they were all sold ultimately into the USA by Grange Motors.
Fantastic. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for our owners and also Bob Beecham.
Thank you.
gentlemen, please give him a warm welcome. Big round of applause, please. The man who designed the Jaguar XJ220 and, as we're about to find out, started the design journey that gave us the F-Type. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Keith Helfett.
Hello, Keith. How are you? You well?
Fine, thank you, yes.
I bet you're recognising a fair few cars around here.
They do look quite familiar. Some of them nearly embarrassingly familiar. I can remember how each little centimetre of those things happened. So even after all these years.
Some of them, I mean, some more than 30 years ago.
Yes, more than 30 years. This is going back nearly 45 years.
Wow, incredible. Well, a great honour to have you here with us today, and you've got a really important job to do.
I have, but first let's talk about the history of the Jaguar F-Type, and of course this is its 10th anniversary year. It seems weird to think that they were launched 10 years ago. They still feel so brand new to me. But it has to be one of the longest ever periods of birth, if you like, of a car in automotive history, because you can trace the beginnings of the F-Types we have here right the way back to the very last E-Types that rolled off the line in 1974. Now, of course, the E-Type had been pulled and bashed about a bit by the increasing amounts of American legislation that were forcing cars to wear things like rubber bumper overriders in order to comply with all of their mad legislation they had at the time. America being, of course, the big market for Jaguar. Also, there was talk in the early 70s that America were going to make convertibles illegal. Mad to think of it now. So Jaguar had to respond to this. There was also a change in the market. People were less interested in out-and-out sports cars. There was a switch towards performance saloons, GT, Grand Tourers, and so Jaguar knew that whatever their car that came next would be, it wouldn't be in the same sporting vein that the E-Type had been in since 1961. Of course, what followed the E-Type was the XJS, but it wasn't really a true sports car, nor was it a true successor to the E-Type. It was a Grand Tourer. It was a comfortable car to fire you across Europe, off to the casinos of Monaco and beyond. However, within Jaguar, there was still a move to ensure that Jaguar as a brand had a proper sports car in their midst. And of course, he's been here today presenting some of the trophies earlier on. Sir John Egan arrived at Jaguar, managed to prize it out of the claws of British Leyland into independence in the early 1980s. And one of the early success stories for Jaguar at the time was the XJ40 Saloon. And the XJ40 Saloon was important because it was made using new ways of making cars. A man called Mike Beasley was doing amazing things with being able to create Jaguars using less parts. And also they knew in order to make more money on cars that some of those cars had to share the same platform. So when they went to the original British Leyland board to get money to put towards the XJ40 project, they had to prove that it could be used across many platforms. It could be a big saloon, but it could also be a sports car. And part of that original proposal was to turn the XJ40 platform into a sports car that one day might be the true successor to the E-Type. The result of that was one of the prototypes you can see here in the Jaguar Daimler Heritage Trust collection today, the XJ41 and XJ42. One was a coupe, one is the wonderful convertible that you have up there, and the original Lions of those cars were instructed by Sir William Lyons, and it's very important because that is one of the last cars that Sir William Lyons ever had true input into. But the route to have true input into that car was with a young designer. And here he is. That's where Keith comes into the story. Keith, I've got a fantastic photograph that we found while we were writing up the story of the F-Type, of you presenting XJ41 to Sir William Lyons at Wappenbury Hall just down the road here. What are your memories of that day?
Well, in fact, that happened many times, because Sir William always preferred to review all his designs outside his home at Wappenbury, And when even with the quarter scale models that I did, we were able to both view them there, but also photograph them without prying eyes, so it was quite useful. But when I took the models to Lopendry, the quarter scale models, he was coming to the studio once a week, and once the thing got into 3D, he had chosen my designs from sketches, but once it got into 3D, he really got interested in it. And it was interesting because I read that this was then part of the history of Jaguars. If he approved, he called Lady Lyons in, and she would have to come and make her comments. And I got really scared, but fortunately she did approve. And then from then on, all the viewings were done there. But he turned out not only to be a tutor and mentor to me, but actually, and this is bizarre in a corporate environment, he was my design boss, because nobody in the company would argue with Sir William when it came to design. So he was the only person that I needed to actually sort of keep happy, but it wasn't like that. He knew exactly what he was trying to do. Although he was quite elderly by then, and he was quite infirm, his eye and his understanding of surface and form was so pin sharp. So I had this incredible privilege as a young designer of working with Sir William Lyons, and effectively having him as my boss for 5 years. So that's how XJ41 and the ones that are there, they came about under his guidance, and from him I learned a lot, because design is a process of lots of difficult decisions, because you change something, you don't know whether it's better or worse. But I had the benefit of all of his experience to learn from. So XJ41 really does have roots in Jaguar's histories, in the essence of Sir William being part of it.
And incredible to think that he had that much influence over a company that he'd retired from probably was 12, 13 years by then, wasn't it?
He was, but he was so revered, particularly in design terms, that, as I say, I'm a young guy, a young designer, you've got Sir William as your boss. It was unreal, absolutely unreal.
But interestingly, Keith, it was looking at some of those images of you presenting the car to Sir William back in those days, but you can start to see some of the hallmarks of your designs, especially those teardrop pop-up headlamps, which look so much like the lamps that eventually made it onto 220.
Yep. The idea of they weren't pop-up headlamps, because when I tried design in my parents' garage in Gaydon, I thought pop-down covers would be a better idea, and the 220 still has that, so that did carry on all the way through. But yes, I suppose I had a style, but also I had those ideas or inspirations from both Sir William and in particular Malcolm Sayers' designs, because virtually all of the shapes and the graphics had movement, and so a teardrop actually has movement in it, so there is some logic to that.
And you can see, actually, when you look at those prototypes here at the Jaguar Daimler Heritage Trust, and then you sort of look back at CX16, which of course was the prototype to the F-Type, there is that family resemblance all the way through. And it's a family resemblance, I think, that sort of takes the best of the E-Type in a very subtle way. So there's just enough for connoisseurs like us lot to recognise it in there, but it's still edgy and new and fresh enough so that people who didn't even know what an E-Type was would feel that it was a new and exciting cutting-edge sports car. Was that sort of something you had to juggle with in that design as you were putting it together?
Well, I realised, because even in the 1980s when we were doing this, when most cars were origami designs, in other words square and hard-edged, even at that time the E-Type was still regarded as the most beautiful car ever. And when you're designing a successor to the most beautiful car ever, you know you can't win that game.
Yes.
However, doing it is irresistible, so you just get on with it. But I had to win him to hold my hand, to support me, but also to learn from. So it was, I'm a lucky bloke to do something like that.
Absolutely. Well, they tested well. You did the convertible that we see up there. There was a coupe as well, and then there was a sort of targa top arrangement, wasn't there? And all of those cars eventually were made through various different models. They would go over to America, wouldn't they, to California or wherever the market testing labs were at that time, and people would get sort of, I imagine, sort of shunted into this little room where they would see that amongst all these other cars and sort of fill out questionnaires. Was that how it worked?
That was called an automotive clinic.
Clinic, yes.
And that's exactly how it worked. And most designers scoffed at the idea. And it wasn't a few people, about 250. We did it 3 times. And they would come, and we were to be flies on the wall and not even speak, because they didn't want us to hear our accents, because it was supposed to be unbadged and sort of not recognisable as anything beforehand. And it was being conducted by a new market research organisation called JD Power.
Oh, wow.
Yes, it was the first of those, and Dave Power personally did the focus groups. And I had exactly the same attitude that most designers did, that this is a waste of time. You're trying to compare the past to the present, etc., etc. And in one of the focus groups, Dave said something to one of the respondents who actually was articulate, because most of them weren't. This was, and he said something, and I thought, he's right. And then I started to listen. From then on, I actually found those clinics really useful, because I could get feedback while you still had time to make changes. And if you got off your high horse and actually just thought this is a way of improving things. So I was the first designer convert into clinics, and it did help, I think. So it was really interesting. And Dave Power was a fantastic bloke.
Incredible, you know, the manufacturers live and die on their JD Power results these days. That was where, that's where it all began. Eventually, though, the clay models, the prototypes, they turned into actual real cars, 3 of them, and they were built by a German coach builder who had a lot to do with British cars because, well, firstly, they'd become famous for the Carman gear, and then, by a weird twist of fate, they'd actually designed Triumph's TR6. They were called Carman, and they were based in Osnabrück in Germany, and those were the coach builders that took your design and created the actual working cars, weren't they? That must have been exciting to see it really working.
Well, it was amazing. The car had originally done in analog, then it became computerized, so it was done in digital. And the bodies, the cars that were in the museum there, were tooled. They weren't handmade bodies, they were tooled by tools made by Carman. And they actually assembled the cars there as well, and only got their running gear back at Coventry when we got back. So I was quite familiar with Osnabrück by the time those things were running.
Well, they were top secret at the time, but unfortunately they weren't top secret for long, because now being working cars, they have to be tested, taken to a race circuit, and you try them out. But of course, at race circuits in those days, it didn't matter how well you camouflage your cars. In the bushes somewhere would be lurking a journalist. They would paparazzi cars at any opportunity, and a journalist from Car Magazine was hiding in the undergrowth. leaked the pictures of the car, and the fact that Jaguar were working on a sports car became known. Then, of course, you've got the problem that all the competition know what you're doing. And I think, Keith, this is probably where XJ41 and 42 take a bit of a sort of turbulent turn, because the gestation period by this point had been so long that others were catching up and even overtaking in terms of performance, in particular power. You started to look at four-wheel drive with FF development, of course, system you looked at with XJ220 as well, and Stuart Roll was here earlier. That turned out to be too heavy, as did the bigger engine that you were putting in, and it all started to get a little bit messy towards the end of the 80s, didn't it? Were you aware of that at the time?
Oh boy, were we only?
Because it didn't only get messy, it actually became political.
Right.
Ford had taken over politically, and there was a lot of jostling for position. And I think that the 41, in that guise, was a casualty of that.
Because, of course, at this point, Ford are doing what Ford do best. They're looking through every penny, looking at where it's spent and why it's spent and how to justify it. The XJ41 and 42 project has been a huge investment for Jaguar over a period of almost 10 years by this point. They'd also been a massive investment from the point of view that they were the first cab-designed cars, not only just for Jaguar, but probably in the British motor industry at the time. And European grade, cab and cam, of course, which is a computer-aided way of planning the manufacture and the tooling of those cars afterwards. But as Keith says, in the early 90s, Ford arrived and lost so many projects that were going on at the time. The XJ41 42 was canned and put on the shelf. Well, kind of, but not quite, because the same concept would keep recurring through history. And at this point we can kind of jump through the various stories that I could spend another afternoon on, where the design ended up on the desk of Tom Walkinshaw at TWR, just down the road in Kidlington, of course, and he had Peter Stevens working for him on XJR15 and a number of other projects. They called Peter Stevens Sticky Stevens down at TWR because he designed all the stickers and the livery for the cars. Peter Stevens, by that point, had left his employment at Lotus and had already taken up employment at the McLaren. So when TWR and Tom Walkinshaw wanted to start a design department, he couldn't take the job. But he had taught a really young and promising designer who had worked at Ford and had been lectured by Peter Stevens and had come from Scotland, and he recommended him to Tom Walkinshaw for the job. That man's name was Ian Callum, and of course Ian Callum now arrives at TWR, as does another Ford-owned brand, Aston Martin, who think they can mitigate some of the costs that were the worry about putting Keith's original prototype into production, because now it's got an Aston Martin badge on it. They could probably ask a bit more money for it. A number of other sketches and concepts and translations come, and of course eventually we saw the DB7 take to the road. Later on, an internal design competition at Jaguar ended up with the team from Whitley taking on the XK8 project, and that would ultimately be the successor to the XJS. And then comes the time when Jaguar want to mark the 50th anniversary of the Jaguar XK engine. Yes. And how best to do that? Well, you don't write press releases. Jaguar are better than that. They don't do glitzy events. Instead, you make a prototype, and that prototype lives here at the Jaguar Daimler Heritage Trust. It was the XK180. Who remembers that photo shoot at Silverstone with the D-type? Everyone had that poster on their wall at the time. And of course, another project that was never really ever going to go into production. It was then finally further refined and designed into a car that definitely sounded better than that aircraft, but that might have gone into production. In fact, some dealerships in the country, and I know this because I've seen the receipts, actually started taking deposits on the next prototype, which was called the F-Type in 2000. That same prototype lives in that building to my left over there. But again, it wasn't viable or cost effective to put into production, and once again you have the situation where what could have been didn't quite happen, until of course you arrive at almost the present day, where CX-16 is a concept Ian Callum was commissioned to do within Jaguar. It toured the world during the early part of the 2010s, gaining all sorts of real accolades for its design, hybrid systems, new motive power in a sports car, really exciting developments. And of course it was all very cleverly crafted to make it sound like us, the public, had forced Jaguar into creating finally the true successor to the E-Type, and it came 10 years ago this year. In 2013, of course, the F-Type arrived. It was launched firstly as a convertible. The Coupé followed a year later. And then ultimately we would get to what we have an example of here from the Jaguar Daimler Heritage Trust, the ultimate F-Type, I'm sure you'll agree, the Project 7. Limited edition vehicle launched at Goodwood with an amazing photo shoot, and the first time the public ever saw it was at the Goodwood Festival of Speed. And of course it has all of those design elements in it to celebrate Jaguar's Le Mans sporting pass, that wonderful, lovely form behind the driver's head there to denote the D-Type. The early cars even had a locker for your race helmet to go next to you in the car. By the time they put them into production, they'd made it a little bit more user-friendly than that. And then, of course, in 2019, we saw the last of the F-Type iterations. This is the facelifted version here that we see with those thinned-off front headlights, that more aggressive stance. And ultimately, ladies and gentlemen, what you're looking at here is the end of an era, because as Jaguar goes into its all-electric future, these are the very last internal combustion engine-powered Jaguars the company will ever make. Ironic then that the descendant of the iconic Jaguar from the 1960s should be the car that ends it all for the internal combustion engine within Jaguar. It will go out to production in the spring of next year. So, I think, before we draw out our winner, which Keith is going to help us with, we should give a big round of applause, I think, to Jaguar's internal combustion engine and the Jaguar F-Type and its 10th anniversary year.
Thanks so much for watching this video, guys. I do hope you've enjoyed it. If you have, underneath this video you'll find a thumbs up and a subscribe button. If you hit that thumbs up, that really helps this channel grow. It will get this video in front of more people just like yourself. If you hit that subscribe button, you'll get a new video from me every week, a notification as soon as I post one. Coming up next, I'm back here at the British Motor Museum for the Retro Truck Show. Even if you're not into your trucks, I promise you, you'll be in for a great day. And if you can't make it, don't worry, the video will be online the same day as always. Once again, thank you so much for watching. I'll see you again soon.